They called him the Sun King, for he believed the world itself rose and fell by his light. But before the gold, before the glory, there was a frightened boy, watching a kingdom tear itself apart. He learned early that mercy was weakness, that fear was loyalty, that God could be worn like a mask. When he smiled, they saw salvation. When he frowned, they trembled. And in the silence between those gestures, an empire was born. He would build palaces that mocked heaven, command armies that swallowed Europe, and love women as if each kiss could buy him eternity. He thought light could last forever, but every sun, no matter how divine, must one day face its dusk. This is not the story of France. It is not the story of kings or crowns. It is the story of a man who dared to become immortal and paid with his soul. If history still burns in your veins, if gold and sin still fascinate you, then stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe. And let the light of the Sun King rise again. Paris was still scarred when the boy inherited it. The echoes of rebellion lingered in the narrow streets, broken cobblestones, burned doorways, whispers that still feared the word monarchy. France was exhausted, hollowed by civil war, trembling under the weight of its own ambition. And from within that trembling rose a child who would one day command the heavens themselves. Louis, son of Anne of Austria and the late King Louis XIII, was only 4 years old when the crown was set upon his head. The crown was too large, its rim pressed against his ears, tilting awkwardly over his small brow. Yet behind the golden weight, the eyes of a boy watched everything. The bowed nobles, the incense, the trembling priests. He saw their hunger for power even as they pretended to serve it. The scent of wax and blood soaked into his memory. Cardinal Mazarin, guardian of both child and crown, ruled in his name. Around them, nobles conspired, armies marched, and Paris itself rose against the throne in the wars known as the Fronde. In a single night, the royal family was forced to flee through the city, through streets lined with muskets and hatred. The young king huddled in his mother's arms, listening to gunfire echo through the dawn mist. That night marked him forever. The child of divine right became the creature of fear. He would never again allow France to rise above him. He would never again run. Years passed, and the boy learned that survival was not granted by mercy but by spectacle. Cardinal Mazarin taught him the theater of monarchy, how silence could command more than a shout, how distance created devotion. Every bow, every procession, every candle in the chapel was a stage direction. Louis grew to understand that the throne was not merely wood and gold, it was illusion. And illusion, when mastered, could rule the world. When Mazarin died, Louis was 22. The ministers expected another regent, another puppet monarch, who would lean upon their counsel. But that morning, the young king summoned them to his chamber. He rose before dawn, always before dawn, and as the light spilled across his chamber floor, he made a decision that would change the fate of France. He would rule alone. From that day forward, he became not merely the king of France, but France itself. The court gasped when he declared it, but Louis felt no fear. Power was no longer something to be shared. It was something to be radiated. The boy who once trembled at the sound of muskets now commanded the rising of the Sunday. At dawn, he began to perform his divinity. Each morning, the doors to his chamber opened in ritual. Courtiers flooded in, hundreds of them, bowing as the king rose from bed. The ceremony of the lever du roi, the rising of the king, became a sacred act. Ministers whispered state secrets as he was dressed in silk and lace. Nobles competed for the honor of holding a sleeve, of tying a ribbon, of handing him a glove. Every gesture, no matter how small, became a privilege bought with loyalty. He moved slowly, deliberately, each motion a sermon in sovereignty. Even his silence was music. Outside, the bells of Paris tolled for morning mass. Inside, the sun began to rise. Louis did not yet call himself the Sun King, but he had already become its reflection. Gold fascinated him. Light obeyed him. The world seemed to awaken only when he permitted it. Beneath the gilded ceilings of the Louvre, he studied himself in mirrors, the first king to truly understand that reflection was power. To rule a nation, one must rule its image. He commissioned portraits in every style, every pose his figure adorned in armor, in silk, in divine light. Each canvas was a proclamation. Here stands a man chosen by God. And yet, beneath the satin and ritual, the boy of the Fronde still lingered, a child who remembered the sound of gunfire, who feared the return of chaos. Order became his obsession. He expanded the army, restructured the treasury, appointed ministers loyal only to him. France began to hum with the rhythm of his command. Tax collectors filled his coffers, soldiers marched to his banners, artists painted his glory. The nation itself seemed to inhale when he did, and exhale when he allowed it. Still, Paris was too close, too crowded with memory. The city that had once betrayed him could not contain his divinity. He dreamed of a palace not in Paris, but beyond it, a place where the world could orbit him freely, where nobles could no longer conspire in shadow. He envisioned a sun made of stone. Versailles was, at first, a hunting lodge, nothing more than timber and mud surrounded by swamps. But in his mind, it became the heart of the universe. He imagined fountains that would sing his name, gardens that would stretch like rays of light, halls so vast they would echo forever. The architects called it impossible. The ministers called it madness. But Louis smiled, for madness, he knew, was just another word for divinity misunderstood. He summoned thousands of men, craftsmen, artists, and soldiers. They dug, they built, they died. Rivers were diverted, forests cut down, fortunes spent. Yet day by day, the swamp became a kingdom of mirrors. Louis rode there often, watching the skeleton of his dream rise from the earth. The scent of wet soil, the pounding of hammers, the rhythm of hundreds of feet, all became music to him. He did not see suffering, he saw creation. When the palace began to gleam under the sun, he saw himself reflected in its golden windows. Versailles was no longer a place. It was an idea. The idea that one man's will could reshape nature, time, and even God. At night, when the workers rested, he would walk alone through the unfinished corridors. Candles flickered along the walls, casting shifting halos around his shadow. In those moments, he almost believed he could touch eternity, that his footsteps would echo long after his flesh had turned to dust. He understood now what Mazarin had meant. Power is theater, and the stage was ready. He thought light could last forever, but every sun, no matter how divine, must one day face its dusk. Louis XIV, once a frightened boy hiding from rebels, would become the sun around which France revolved. And every morning, as dawn poured through the silk curtains of Versailles, he would rise not as man but as myth. The court had never seen anything like it. When Louis moved to Versailles, it was as if the earth itself shifted its axis. Carriages rolled from every province, their wheels deep in mud, bearing lords, duchesses, bishops, poets, and spies. They came not out of loyalty but necessity. To be seen at court was to exist. To be absent was to vanish. In Paris, the nobles once plotted revolts. At Versailles, they plotted invitations to the king's supper. The very air of the palace hummed with rivalry. Every smile hid a blade. Every gesture, every bow, every embroidered sleeve was a calculation. And Louis watched it all, amused. He had learned that control was not imposed, it was orchestrated. The courtiers, adorned in jewels and powdered wigs, believed they were free to play their games. But every move had been composed by him. He was both monarch and composer, shaping chaos into harmony. Each morning began with ritual precision. At the first knock, servants entered his chamber carrying light. Curtains were drawn to reveal the rising sun, always perfectly timed, always aligned with his awakening. The room itself seemed to breathe in golden rhythm, every object glimmering in approval. The nobles assembled, murmuring prayers of flattery. The lever du roi began. One held his shirt, another his gloves, another presented the basin of water. Each gesture, a privilege ranked by hierarchy. To hand the king a handkerchief was an honor worth a lifetime of ambition. Louis did not speak. He did not need to. His silence was the law of gravity that held their world together. Afterward came the grande entrée, the morning procession through the Hall of Mirrors. The courtiers lined the gilded corridor like constellations, awaiting their Sunday. Musicians played. Perfumed air swirled through the marble hall. Louis walked slowly, his steps measured, his eyes distant, a celestial body surrounded by orbiting stars. In that mirrored hall, he became eternal. Each wall reflected his image 100 times over, stretching endlessly into illusion. Even he could not tell where the man ended and the god began. Versailles was no longer a palace, it was a temple of performance. Every meal, every hunt, every mass was choreographed to reinforce the myth. Painters captured him as Apollo, the god of light. Sculptors carved his likeness into fountains, where marble nymphs bowed to his eternal youth. He was no longer merely Louis. He was Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King. France glowed in his radiance. At least, that was the illusion. Behind the golden gates, the people starved. Taxes multiplied. Farmers sold their tools for bread. But none of that touched the marble of Versailles. Suffering existed only as rumor, muffled by music. Louis did not ignore it, he simply believed it was necessary. For what was a god without worshippers? What was glory without sacrifice? When ministers brought him reports of famine, he looked toward the gardens instead. Endless, perfect, symmetrical. They represented order, his ultimate faith. Even nature itself was disciplined to obey. Thousands of gardeners maintained the illusion. Every flower, every hedge, every fountain followed the rhythm of his reign. Water was forced uphill to please him. Trees were uprooted overnight to realign with the geometry of his will. And when the fountains rose at his signal, he felt the same power that priests claimed for heaven. He had become creation itself. But creation demands witnesses. So he filled Versailles with festivals, ballets, and feasts that lasted for days. Torches burned through the night as fireworks reflected upon the marble pools. Musicians played symphonies written in his honor. Dancers performed as planets spinning around the Sunday. He, of course, was the center, always the center. In his youth, Louis had trained as a dancer. Now he transformed that discipline into dominion. Every gesture on the stage mirrored his movements in life. Deliberate, poised, inevitable. His body was his language, his presence, a declaration. He danced not for art, but to remind them that he was alive, that his body was both France's axis and its cage. The courtiers cheered. They adored their living Apollo. But adoration is never love, it is hunger in disguise. Behind the applause, jealousy brewed. Ministers whispered of corruption. Mistresses whispered of prophecy. Yet none dared to confront him, for confrontation required shadow, and there were no shadows left under the Sunday. In private, Louis began to fear stillness. He felt it in the quiet moments before dawn, when the palace slept and the candles melted low. Alone, surrounded by mirrors, he sometimes thought he saw another figure staring back, a tired man, worn by grandeur, eyes haunted by the child who once fled through gunfire. He would turn away before the image could speak, for to acknowledge weakness was to betray the illusion. So he worked harder. He built more. He demanded perfection not only from his court, but from the universe itself. He ordered new wings for the palace, more fountains, more marble, more gold. Each addition was both triumph and tombstone. Even his faith became performance. Chapels were built, mass celebrated daily, hymns composed in his name. Priests praised him as God's reflection on earth. Louis prayed not for salvation, but for endurance. He did not seek heaven's favor. He sought its mirror. Yet within that relentless brilliance, humanity withered. Catherine, his queen, watched from afar, quiet, devout, invisible. She lived within the same palace, but in another world entirely. Her husband belonged to France, to light, to illusion. She belonged to prayer. Her loneliness filled the palace corridors like an unseen fog. Louis noticed, but not enough to stop. He was already too far gone, orbiting his own legend. By the time the palace neared completion, Versailles was no longer a reflection of the king's glory, it was the embodiment of his denial. The boy who once feared the mob now feared mortality. The sunlight that crowned him now revealed the cracks in his perfection. And yet, the more fragile he became, the brighter he demanded the world to shine. Every mirror had to be polished daily. Every candle replaced before it burned too low. The light could never die, because if it did, he might see what lived in the dark. He had become both prisoner and deity, trapped within the radiance of his own making. Outside the golden gates, peasants whispered his name with awe and bitterness. Inside, courtiers continued their dance, unaware they were part of a vast machinery that turned on vanity and fear. Louis stood at the center of it all, bathed in eternal daylight, and somewhere deep within, the memory of a frightened child stirred a boy clutching his mother in the dark. Hearing the chaos of France beyond the door, he did not remember his fear anymore, but it remembered him. The age of light had begun. Versailles no longer belonged to France. France belonged to Versailles. The palace had become a world unto itself, a gleaming labyrinth of marble and silence, where time moved not by the turning of the sun but by the rhythm of the king's footstep. Every corridor pulsed with ritual. Every chamber glowed with reflected light. The air itself seemed perfumed with hierarchy. Even the servants walked in measured grace, for every movement within those walls was part of a divine performance, the theater of obedience. It began at dawn. When the first bells rang, the court stirred like a vast organism awakening. The sound of rustling silk filled the halls as hundreds prepared themselves not for life, but for spectacle. They dressed not for comfort, but survival, each ribbon, each jewel a weapon in the war of appearances. To be noticed by the Sun King was a blessing. To be forgotten was death. By sunrise, the courtiers gathered beneath the golden ceilings of the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors. There, light burst through the windows in radiant spears, scattering across the mirrored walls until the entire hall shimmered as if made of liquid fire. At its center, Louis appeared serene, flawless, untouchable. He walked slowly, surrounded by ministers and guards who followed like constellations bound to his orbit. When he paused, they paused. When he breathed, they waited. He had become not merely the King of France, but the master of time. Beyond the mirrors, the true machinery of power turned invisible, relentless. Ministers penned edicts to shape the lives of millions. Tax collectors drained villages to fund the gardens. Armies marched across Europe under banners embroidered with the king's Sunday. But within Versailles, none of that existed. Here, only the illusion mattered. Versailles was both stage and prison. The nobles who once commanded armies were now trapped in silken chains. They competed not for land, but for glances, not for honor, but for access. A misplaced gesture could ruin a name. A whispered rumor could destroy a legacy. Louis understood this better than anyone. He had seen what uncontrolled power could do. The Fronde had taught him that rebellion was born not from poverty, but from pride. So he destroyed pride with elegance. He gave his nobles gold, feasts, and glory, and in return, took their freedom. Each noble was assigned a role, one to pour the king's wine, one to hold his cloak, one to escort him to mass. Rank was measured in proximity to his body. The closer one stood to the sun, the brighter and more dangerous the light became. At night, the palace transformed. Candles flamed in every room, 1,000 tiny suns reflecting endlessly in mirrors. The air shimmered with music, perfume, and whispers. Dancers glided across marble floors while courtiers observed, calculating every movement for advantage. And above them all, in the highest chamber, Louis watched, always unseen, always aware. He had turned Versailles into the greatest instrument of surveillance in Europe. Nothing escaped him. He knew who visited whom, who prayed too little, who drank too much, who dared to love without permission. Even desire was taxed under his gaze. But behind the brilliance, something darker began to stir. Whispers of exhaustion crept through the corridors. Servants collapsed from the endless demands of ceremony. Ministers grew pale under the weight of paperwork and flattery. The courtiers' smiles tightened, their eyes hollowed. The endless light had begun to blind them all. Even the gardens, once perfect, began to rebel. Roots pushed against stone paths. The fountains, overworked, sputtered in the heat. To maintain perfection was to fight against nature itself, and nature was growing restless. Louis did not see it, or perhaps he refused to. He had come to believe that if the world could be ordered, if every garden trimmed, every candle aligned, then chaos could be defeated forever. In his mind, Versailles was not vanity. It was redemption. He built new wings, new fountains, new chapels. Each addition was meant to purify the disorder of existence. The more he controlled, the closer he felt to God, or to what he thought God should be. But Control is never creation. It is suffocation, dressed in gold. The palace began to breathe too heavily, its beauty too perfect, its silence too deep. Behind the walls, the servants whispered prayers not for the king, but for their own deliverance. Some said they heard footsteps in the empty halls at night, echoes of those who had collapsed unseen, erased by ceremony. Still, the performances continued. One night, Louis hosted a masquerade to celebrate the anniversary of Versailles. The theme was Heaven on Earth. Hundreds of courtiers appeared in shimmering costumes, angels, nymphs, gods. They danced beneath chandeliers so bright they burned the eye. And yet, among the glittering masks, something else moved, a quiet unease. The laughter rang too sharply, the smiles too wide. Even Louis, standing at the head of the hall, felt a flicker of something he did not recognize. Was it fear, or was it memory? For a brief instant, the mirrored hall reflected not gods, but prisoners, each caught in their own perfection, unable to escape. He looked away. The illusion had to continue. From that day forward, he became not merely the King of France, but France itself. As the foundations were laid, workers died under the strain. Their bodies were buried quietly beyond the palace gates. No one spoke of it. Death had no place in the house of eternal light. Inside the court, the queen's health began to fade. She prayed daily for her husband's soul, though he rarely joined her. His devotions were public, not private. Another ceremony, another performance. Faith, like love, had become spectacle. Yet something began to change in Louis's gaze. He watched his courtiers with colder precision, as if measuring the distance between devotion and deceit. He began to sense the emptiness of adoration. The endless praise, once intoxicating, now echoed hollowly against marble walls. He had surrounded himself with mirrors, and now they began to reflect his solitude. Outside Versailles, war bled the nation dry. Fields lay barren, soldiers unburied. But within, the music played on, as if to drown out the cries of the world. The sun could not set, and so it burned. The palace had grown too vast to be human. Versailles had devoured the horizon, a sea of marble, fountains, and gilded iron stretching farther than faith could follow. From the air, it looked less like a residence and more like a celestial machine, an engine built to capture sunlight and turn it into power. Every dawn, the mechanism awoke. The gates opened with military precision. Hundreds of carriages rolled in, carrying nobles polished to mirror brightness. Thousands of servants scurried like clockwork, winding the gears of ceremony. The fountains roared to life as if commanded by divine decree. It was not a palace anymore. It was a heartbeat, and the man who called himself the sun was its pulse. Each chamber had its rhythm. The chapel's prayers timed to his footsteps. The kitchen's fires synchronized with the royal appetite. Even the gardens moved in harmony with his routine. Flowers trimmed to bloom exactly as he passed. But perfection, once achieved, begins to decay. Beneath the marble, the pipes leaked. The fountains faltered under the strain of endless beauty. The mirrors clouded with smoke and breath. What was built to immortalize glory now demanded constant sacrifice. Wood, water, flesh, and faith. The peasants who carried timber to Versailles whispered that the palace ate forests. The masons said it devoured bones. Every candle that glowed in the Hall of Mirrors burned a life somewhere unseen. Louis knew, and yet he did not stop. He had become both prisoner and priest of his own creation. Each morning he rose surrounded by attendants who worshipped him in silence. And each night he lay awake beneath ceilings painted with his triumphs, unable to sleep beneath the weight of eternity. When he closed his eyes, he saw light, always light, blinding, golden, absolute. But sometimes, hidden within it, a shadow moved. The courtiers could not see it. They were too dazzled by the performance. But in the stillness between ceremonies, Louis would feel it, a quiet doubt crawling beneath his skin. He wondered if he ruled France, or if Versailles ruled him. The palace required endless attention. Every inch demanded restoration, polishing, worship. He built galleries to impress God, but found only his reflection staring back. The more he tried to preserve perfection, the faster it withered. Gold, he learned, is just metal. It shines brightest before it tarnishes. Outside the palace, the kingdom began to starve. Taxes multiplied, villages emptied, and the songs of harvest were replaced by the silence of hunger. But news traveled slowly to Versailles, and when it arrived perfumed, softened, wrapped in courtesies. In the gilded halls, famine was only a rumor. War was a painting. Suffering was a number signed by a minister's hand. Louis had created a world where truth could not survive. The courtiers smiled too perfectly, the priests blessed too eagerly, the artists praised too lavishly. Every word was gold leaf thin, fragile, hiding the decay beneath. He began to crave silence. But silence was forbidden. Versailles was an orchestra that could never stop playing. If the music ever ceased, if the ritual ever broke, the illusion might crumble, and the god might be revealed as a man. So the performances continued. Balls, feasts, hunts, masses, each one heavier, grander, emptier. The courtiers danced not for joy but survival. They bowed lower, laughed louder, as if noise could drown the echo of fear growing beneath the marble floors. And in that echo, Louis began to hear something, not rebellion, not heresy, but time, ticking softly beneath the drums of ceremony. Time unbent by gold or glory. Time, that patient thief which even kings cannot command. He ordered more candles, as if light could silence it. He commissioned more portraits, as if memory could be rewritten in paint. He surrounded himself with music so divine that even angels might envy it. But still, beneath the melody, the ticking continued. Each sound reminded him of the child he once was, the boy who had watched nobles rebel against his mother, the boy who had vowed never to be humiliated again. He had succeeded. He had conquered fear. He had become the god he once imagined. But gods do not sleep, and gods are never loved. When the queen passed through the halls, her footsteps echoed softly, a ghost among marble saints. Her prayers lingered longer than her laughter ever had. Louis avoided her chapel. He said it was too small, too dim, but in truth, it was too human. There were no mirrors in that room. One evening, after a long ceremony, he wandered into the hall of mirrors alone. The candles flickered, distorted by the thousand reflections. In the glass, his image stretched endlessly, a corridor of kings, all identical, all staring back. He tried to find himself among them, the boy, the man, the ruler, but there was no difference now. The mask had fused to the flesh. Outside, thunder rolled over the gardens. Rain struck the windows like the hands of the forgotten. He stood unmoving, watching his reflection blur as water streaked down the glass. For the first time in decades, the Sun King felt the cold. And in that cold, he understood what he had built. Not a palace, but a tomb carved in light, where every mirror was a gravestone and every candle a requiem. Versailles would outlive him. It would outlive everyone. It would remain long after faith and flesh had faded, a perfect monument to imperfection. He turned from the mirror, but the reflections did not. They kept watching. Their eyes burned with gold. Versailles had become a theater without walls. Every courtyard, every gallery, every garden was a stage upon which the king's shadow moved. Even the fountains seemed to bow as he passed, their water glittering like applause, frozen in motion. Louis XIV did not merely rule, he performed sovereignty. To the court, he was not a man but a ceremony. To the world, he was not mortal but movement. And in this illusion, he found both ecstasy and torment. Each morning, as the royal curtains unfurled to greet the dawn, he rose not as a king, but as the sun incarnate. The courtiers assembled in sacred silence, watching as attendants robed him in silk and gold. It was not clothing, it was armor of divinity. The rituals had become religion, the mass of power, the gospel of appearances. Louis moved through them with a precision born of faith. Every glance, every gesture, every step was deliberate, a choreography of control. He had learned that men obey not from fear alone, but from enchantment. And so he became the world's most disciplined illusionist. At the heart of Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors, Louis found his altar, the stage. Music filled the air like incense. Lully's strings trembled, flutes whispered, the harpsichord murmured divine approval. There, before nobles dressed like stars, Louis danced not as a man, but as Apollo, the god of light himself. The courtiers gasped, not from wonder, but from revelation. In their eyes, he had ceased to be human. He had become myth, and myth, unlike flesh, does not decay. He danced to outlive time. He danced to silence doubt. He danced to remind heaven that there could be only one Sunday. But even as his feet struck the stage, his body whispered what his pride could not: mortality. Each movement demanded perfection, and perfection demanded pain. The muscles of his legs ached. The breath grew shorter, the pulse heavier. Yet he endured, for to falter was to fall from divinity. Outside, the wars consumed France. The fields burned, the peasants fled, the rivers ran red. But inside the golden palace, the drums of ballet drowned the cries of hunger. The court danced while the kingdom starved. And Louis, radiant, flawless, wrapped in lace and light, believed that this was order. When the music stopped, silence became unbearable. Without motion, the mask cracked. In solitude, he felt the weight of the body beneath the crown, the sweat, the heartbeat, the exhaustion hidden behind the choreography. He began to understand that he had built Versailles not to rule the world, but to flee from it. The palace was his mirror, and the dance was his confession. He feared that without movement, he would vanish. So he commanded more spectacles, more operas, more festivals. Nights at Versailles became endless, the chandeliers burning until dawn. Gold dripped from the ceilings, wine flooded the marble floors, and laughter echoed like prayer. The courtiers called it grandeur. The priests called it glory. But the servants, the unseen souls who polished the mirrors and carried the candles, called it madness. Still, the king danced. He danced through illness, through grief, through loss. When his first son died, he ordered a masquerade. When war returned to his borders, he staged a triumphal procession. Each performance was a defiance of fate. Each bow, a weapon against despair. The poets compared him to the sun that never sets. But even the sun burns itself to shine. His heart began to falter, not with love, but with exhaustion. He felt a strange emptiness beneath the applause, as if the music no longer reached his soul. The glory had become noise. The stage, a prison. The god, a ghost. And yet, he could not stop, for to stop would mean confronting the silence that waited like death beyond the music. One winter evening, the court gathered for a grand spectacle. The air was heavy with perfume and powder, the candles casting halos of smoke upon the mirrors. Louis appeared in radiant gold, a living sun in human form. Every gaze followed him, every breath paused in worship. When the first bells rang, the court stirred like a vast organism awakening. The sound of rustling silk filled the halls as hundreds prepared themselves not for life, but for spectacle. They dressed not for comfort, but survival. Each ribbon, each jewel, a weapon in the war of appearances. Each step struck the marble like a heartbeat of the divine. The courtiers wept from awe. The priests whispered prayers. Still, the king danced. He could feel the tremor in his leg, the pain hidden beneath perfection, the invisible cost of being eternal. The applause roared, but he heard only the echo of his own breath, shallow, uneven, human. In that moment, Louis understood that divinity was just endurance made beautiful. After the performance, he returned alone to his private chapel. The candles flickered weakly, the gold leaf on the walls dulled by wax and smoke. He knelt beneath the crucifix, a god before a god. He had danced for power, for love, for immortality, but never for peace. And peace, he realized, was the one thing his reign could never afford. Outside, the musicians packed their instruments. The courtiers retold the night's glory. Versailles glowed as if heaven had descended upon earth. But in the small chapel at its heart, the Sun King sat in darkness, the sweat of his dance drying on his skin like tears unspoken. The performance was over. The illusion remained. In the mornings, the mirrors watched him wake. Hundreds of reflections shimmered along the gilded walls, not faces, but fragments of the same illusion. A man sculpted into eternity. The sunlight touched his skin like reverence, but the warmth no longer reached him. The golden room felt colder each year. Age had begun its quiet conquest. But as the final note lingered, the king stood motionless at the center of the stage. Versailles was louder than ever, but within him, the silence spread. He had made the mirror his most loyal subject. Every morning, he stood before it, studying not his face, but his legend. The eyes remained sharp, but the edges softened. The gold around him magnified every wrinkle into an omen. He ordered brighter candles, smoother powder, heavier robes, anything to delay the truth that glitter could not conceal. For decades, he had believed that beauty was control, and control was divinity. But the mirror whispered otherwise. It reflected not Apollo the god, but Louis the man, a creature of bone and breath, finite beneath the veneer of the infinite. He began to resent his own reflection, yet could not look away. And peace, he realized, was the one thing his reign could never afford. Versailles became his temple of denial. Painters flattered him into eternity. Sculptors carved his youth in marble. Every portrait proclaimed immortality, as if art could bribe time. He staged endless festivals, celebrations of his glory that now felt like funerals in disguise. Each performance was an exorcism, an attempt to banish decay through motion and applause. The court obeyed. They laughed, they danced, they praised. But behind their powdered smiles, fear grew, the kind of fear that reigns when the god begins to fade. The nobles whispered that the king's shadow seemed longer, that his divine light flickered in winter, that his smile had become too still. And Louis, who had once demanded worship, now demanded silence. No one was to speak of age, illness, or death in his presence. Even the word mortality vanished from Versailles, replaced with sunset. But he knew. Every heartbeat told him. The Sun King was setting, and all the mirrors knew it too. In the Hall of Mirrors, he often walked alone after midnight. The chandeliers burned low, their wax dripping like slow tears onto the marble. He moved through the corridor, as through a dream, surrounded by 1,000 reflections, 1,000 versions of himself. Frozen mid-step, forever radiant, forever young. He lifted his gaze and saw infinity, staring back endless Louis, endless light. For a moment, he almost believed in the god he had created. Then the candlelight wavered, and the illusion broke. The reflections distorted, the faces warped. He saw not divinity, but a mask cracking under its own gold. He stopped walking. The silence swallowed the music of memory. For the first time in decades, the king felt small, not the sun, but a shadow in his own house. He understood that he had spent his life choreographing an empire of mirrors, so perfect that even God could not enter. And now he was trapped within it. The mask of immortality demanded sacrifice. He banished rest. He starved pleasure. He denied weakness. To sustain the illusion, he must never show exhaustion, never reveal despair. His body became an altar to image, his mind a prisoner to performance. The courtiers saw him glitter and thought him divine, but beneath the gold, the man was vanishing. He could no longer tell where Louis ended and the Sun King began. The crown had fused with the skull. The role had consumed the soul. And in that fusion, there was only silence. In the gardens, statues of Apollo gleamed in moonlight, perfect, eternal, mocking. Louis would stand before them during sleepless nights, feeling the chill of stone that would outlast his bones. He envied their stillness, their peace, their immunity to time. All his wars, all his ballets, all his monuments, and still, he could not conquer decay. The fountains whispered their cruel secret, that the water which sparkled by day always froze by night. The king turned from them and returned to his chambers. There, among portraits of his younger self, he sat before the mirror again. The reflection watched him, unblinking. It no longer obeyed him. It no longer flattered. For the first time, The man and the myth looked at each other and did not recognize one another. In the distance, dawn began to rise. The real sun, unbound by crowns or prayers. Its light entered the window and struck the mirror, splitting his reflection into 1,000 fragments of gold. Louis stared into that shattering brilliance and saw truth at last, that even the sun must burn itself to shine, that eternity is not conquered, only borrowed. Versailles would remember him in perfection. History would remember him in gold. But the man who once believed himself immortal would be remembered only by the silence that followed his dance. She arrived at dawn, veiled in white and silence. He stopped walking. The silence swallowed the music of memory. Her name was Maria Theresa of Austria, daughter of kings, child of peace treaties, and offering to destiny. At 17, she was both gift and symbol, wrapped in lace and diplomacy. She stepped onto French soil with trembling hands, unaware that this would be the last time she would ever belong to herself. Versailles was not yet a palace, then only a hunting lodge reborn in ambition. But already it glowed with the hunger of the man who would call himself the Sunday. Louis met her with ceremony, not warmth. His eyes measured before they admired. To him, she was not a bride, but a duty carved in velvet, the mother of his heirs, the seal of alliance, the mirror to his divinity. And she, raised in Spanish piety, saw in him the will of God, radiant, unreachable, absolute. The people called it a marriage of nations, but in truth, it was a marriage of silence. The queen's world became one of distance and ritual. Each morning, she knelt before the crucifix and prayed for a husband she could not touch. Each evening, she dined before the court, smiling beneath the weight of jewels heavier than her heart. Around her, the courtiers shimmered with charm and cruelty. They spoke in riddles and glances, their tongues gilded with flattery. She understood little of their language, not just their French, but the far subtler dialect of power and deceit. Her gentleness was mistaken for dullness, her devotion for weakness, her faith for blindness. Versailles did not know how to love a quiet queen. Louis shone brighter each day, his glory growing as hers diminished. He danced, he ruled, he conquered. The court followed his every gesture like scripture, and Maria watched, always from behind. She bore him children. She endured his absences. She forgave his infidelities first as rumor, then as spectacle. One by one, his mistresses became stars in his orbit, glittering, dangerous, and adored. They wore diamonds. She wore duty. They spoke to him in laughter. She prayed for his soul in silence. And through it all, she never complained. Her suffering was not rebellion, it was sacrifice. She believed that God saw her patience, and that perhaps, in heaven, mercy would mean love. But Versailles was a cruel cathedral. Behind its walls, devotion was mistaken for dullness, and piety was mocked as ignorance. The Queen's Chapel, her only refuge, became her exile. She would kneel for hours while the corridors outside whispered her irrelevance. Louis rarely visited. When he did, the distance between them was measured not in steps, but in centuries. He called her the Good Queen, and meant it as pity. Her prayers became quieter, not because faith was fading, but because hope was dying. In her private chambers, the mirrors told another story. The candles flickered, reflecting not beauty, but loneliness. Her face, still soft, still young, began to resemble the Madonna she prayed to, serene, sorrowful, and infinitely alone. She had given her youth to France, her body to heirs, her soul to God. There was nothing left that was truly hers. And yet she loved him, even as he betrayed her in the open, even as the court mocked her devotion, even as her name became a whisper of pity. She loved him still, not because he deserved it, but because she did not know how to stop. Her love was not passion. It was faith, and faith is the cruelest kind of love. The years passed like shadows across marble. Children came and died. The court laughed and forgot. Louis grew more magnificent, and the queen more invisible. When he looked at her, he saw not a woman, but an emblem. A reminder that even the sun required a moon to reflect him. He built palaces for his mistresses, chapels for his sins, and monuments for his glory. But for her, he built nothing. and yet she prayed for him every night. Her rosary became a chain, one she held not to escape, but to endure. Then came the day when even endurance failed. The queen fell ill after childbirth. The court moved on before the doctors did. Louis visited once, spoke softly, and left for another hunt. She lay in her bed beneath gold ceilings, surrounded by angels carved in plaster, and realized she had never truly lived in her own life. Her breath grew shallow. Her eyes searched for a window, not for light, but for sky. They said she died peacefully. But peace is only for the remembered, and Maria Theresa was not remembered. In the days after her death, the court wore black for a week, then gold again. The king did not speak of her. The chaplains murmured prayers. The courtiers gossiped about dresses, and Versailles returned to its endless dance. Her name faded, her portrait gathered dust, her rosary was placed in the gilded drawer. Yet in the chapel where she had prayed, the candles still burned low each night, their flames trembling in unseen wind, as if heaven itself remembered what the court had chosen to forget. After Maria Theresa's death, Versailles did not grieve. It glittered. The court mourned in silk and gossip, its sorrow measured by fashion, not faith. Within a week, laughter returned to the corridors. Music rose again from the marble halls, and with it, the heartbeat of a kingdom that had forgotten how to feel. Louis XIV, the Sun King, walked among them like a god who had outlived his worshippers. His eyes were dry, his gestures perfect, his mask unbroken. But within that silence, something stirred. Not love, not grief, but hunger. He had lost a wife, yes, but not his vanity. The sun cannot live without something to shine upon. And into that void stepped Madame de Montespan. She entered not as a supplicant, but as a storm. Where Maria Theresa was devotion, Montespan was desire. She did not kneel, she commanded. Her beauty was not gentle, but theatrical. Eyes like confession, laughter like a challenge, presence like perfume that filled the air long after she was gone. She was married, witty, and dangerously intelligent. She understood the stage of Versailles better than anyone, and she knew that the king did not want honesty. He wanted wonder, and she gave it to him. Within months, she became not just his mistress, but his reflection. If he was the sun, she was the flame that made his light burn brighter. Together, they ruled the court like twin deities of pleasure. Versailles transformed unter her influence. Music swelled louder. Feasts grew longer. The air itself seemed to shimmer with excess. Painters captured her smile. Poets compared her to Venus. And priests whispered prayers they did not mean. She walked through the hall of mirrors as if she owned it. And in truth, she did. The courtiers who once pitied the queen now knelt before the new one. They learned quickly, to please the king, one must please the woman who held his heart. She wore power like perfume, intoxicating and invisible, and even Louis, master of all ceremonies, found himself following her rhythm. But the sun does not share its sky without cost. Beneath the gold and laughter, something darker began to grow. Madame de Montespan feared age. She feared losing him to another, as she had once taken him herself. And fear, in Versailles, was never silent. The whispers began quietly, servants dismissed, priests replaced, physicians disappearing into the night. Rumors spread through the gilded corridors like smoke, that the king's beloved had turned to forbidden arts, that in secret chambers, beneath the scent of incense and roses, she sought to bind him through blood and ash. They called it La Messe Noire, the Black Mass, a ritual of devotion and damnation where prayers were spoken backward and the chalice filled with blasphemy. Louis heard the rumors. At first, he laughed. Then he wondered. And finally, he feared. Because in the solitude of his golden chamber, when the candles burned too low and the silence grew too loud, he began to sense that his power no longer belonged entirely to heaven. He had made himself divine, and now the divine refused to look at him. Montespan, once radiant, began to fade. Her laughter grew brittle, her gaze sharper, her beauty almost desperate. She watched the king withdraw into his rituals, his hunts, his prayers. The same man who had once worshipped her now measured her with suspicion. She clung to him with words, with gifts, with memories. But nothing could hold sunlight when the day was ending. The court turned cold. Her enemies multiplied: women she had mocked, priests she had defied, servants she had dismissed. And in the mirrors she once loved, she began to see herself not as a goddess, but as a ghost in gold. Then came the affair of the poisons, a scandal that consumed France in whispers of murder, sorcery, and betrayal. Hundreds were accused: nobles, priests, even members of the royal household. They spoke of powders, of infants burned for spells, of dark masses said in the name of love. And at the heart of it all, her name appeared. Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress, mother of his children, accused of witchcraft to hold his heart. Louis' silence was the verdict. He neither condemned her nor defended her. He simply looked away. From that moment, she ceased to exist in public. Banished from his presence, she lingered in the shadows of Versailles, a relic of a forbidden empire. She aged alone, surrounded by memories that no longer glittered. Her perfumes turned sour. Her laughter vanished. Yet she did not leave. Perhaps she could not, because Versailles was not a palace. It was a spell, and she was one of its victims. Louis, now older, turned to religion, to repentance, to silence. He filled the palace with priests instead of poets, hymns instead of dances. But even as he prayed, he could not forget her. He dreamed of her eyes, her touch, her defiance, and of the sins that had made him feel most alive. The Sun King sought salvation, but his shadow still wore perfume. Years later, when Montespan died in a convent, the bells of Paris did not ring. No processions marched. No mirrors mourned. She had once been the heart of France, and now she was only a name whispered in scandalous histories. But those who served her swore that, in her final hours, she smiled as if she knew something no priest could absolve. Perhaps she understood that love, like power, was never meant to be holy. Versailles, 1677. The air was sweet with roses and poison. Beyond the gardens, the fountains whispered. But what they whispered was not prayer. For beneath the polished floors, beneath the shining mirrors and endless corridors of gold, there were rooms where the light never reached. And in those rooms, France's most beautiful woman prayed to something other than God. Madame de Montespan had once ruled Versailles with laughter. Now she ruled it with fear. Her power was absolute, her smile enough to raise or ruin a noble family. The king's affection had made her untouchable, and she had mistaken that for immortality. But immortality has its own priests. They did not wear robes of silk, but of shadow. They carried no candles, only knives. And when the court began to whisper that the king's favor was waning, when younger faces began to dance closer to his gaze, Madame de Montespan sought their counsel. It began with powders, small vials, slipped into gloves and perfumes, said to renew passion or inspire faithfulness. Such charms were common at court. Love was a game of performance, and every performance needed a script. But soon, the powders changed. The prayers turned darker. The names invoked were no longer saints. One priest, Abbé Guibourg, became her confesseur in secret. They met in hidden chambers near the Rue Beauregard, far from the golden eyes of Versailles. There he would say Mass, but not for God. A black altar, a naked body, a chalice filled with blood. They prayed for the king's love, for the death of rivals, for the eternity of her reign. It was said that during one of these rites, the host was consecrated not in reverence, but in blasphemy, and her name, the name once whispered in silk, was offered to the devil himself. At Versailles, the king rose each morning as the Sunday, but shadows now clung to him like mist. He felt them in the walls, in the glances of his courtiers, in the sudden stillness of a corridor when he entered. He felt her distance, the soft decay of devotion. He loved her still, but unease began to rot the root of his affection. Every sickness, every sleepless night, every political failure seemed to carry her scent. And the scent no longer smelled like roses. Then came the first death. A servant collapsed after serving the king's drink. A letter was found burned, half illegible, But what remained were names, noble names, familiar names. The king ordered silence, but silence has never been loyal. It whispered, through the corridors of gold, through the marble halls, through the city itself, until Paris stank not of perfume, but of fear. The affair of the poisons had begun. They came for fortune-tellers, midwives, soldiers, anyone who had touched the strange and unseen. Each name led to another. Each confession opened a deeper pit. Torture revealed what truth could not, that the court itself was infected. Poison flowed through it like blood, from kitchens to chapels, from gardens to the royal bed. And in the center of it all, they found the name that none dared speak aloud, Madame de Montespan. She denied everything. She was the Sun King's mistress, mother to his children, the most powerful woman in Europe. How could she, the embodiment of beauty and grace, be part of this? And yet, the evidence grew. Witnesses spoke of rituals, of infants buried, of her face, half lit by candlelight, reciting words that no Christian should know. Louis refused to believe. But belief is fragile, and the king, who once believed himself divine, began to fear that he had been cursed. The court held its breath. No one dared speak her name in public, but everyone thought it in silence. They bowed to her in the hall of mirrors, but crossed themselves when she passed. At night, her rooms were empty. The servants who entered them spoke of a smell, not of perfume, but of burning wax and iron. Louis withdrew from her. He stopped visiting her apartments. He no longer called for her at morning mass. And for the first time since his youth, the Sun King prayed not for victory, but for protection. In her despair, Montespan turned even deeper into the darkness she had invited. She demanded new charms, stronger prayers, more desperate promise. But nothing worked. The king's eyes had turned away, and the sun, once hers, no longer rose for her alone. In the quiet of her chambers, she understood the cost of love when it is built on worship, because worship ends not with loss, but with damnation. When the investigations reached their peak, hundreds were arrested. Some were burned. Some vanished into dungeons that never reopened. Others took their secrets to the grave. Montespan's name was never publicly tried. The king ordered her spared, not from mercy, but from terror. To admit her guilt would have been to admit his own, and so he buried the truth beneath silence. She lived, but her world ended. She wandered Versailles like a ghost in silk. Her reflection in the mirrors grew older, her footsteps slower, her eyes hollow. The woman who once commanded nations now could not command a single glance. And when she finally left the palace, no one followed. The fountains did not sing. The sun did not pause. Versailles simply continued, as if she had never existed at all. Versailles, 1683. The air had grown colder. Even the mirrors seemed dimmer now, as if the palace itself had learned to mourn. The scandals had not destroyed the king, but they had changed him. His laughter came less often, his prayers grew longer, and when he walked through the hall of mirrors, his reflection looked older than he remembered. The Sun King had begun to set. Madame de Montespan still lived at court, but her radiance was fading. The nobles still bowed to her, yet their eyes moved past her, toward younger beauty, fresher ambition. The king no longer visited her chambers. He had built her a throne beside his own, and then silently abandoned it. Now, in the evenings, she sat by the great windows of Versailles, watching the twilight sink over the gardens she had once ruled. The fountains still danced, but they no longer danced for her. The court spoke in whispers. They said she had been cursed, that the devil had taken back what he was owed. They said her beauty had turned against her, that her mirror showed not her face, but the face of the dead child buried beneath the altar years ago. She ignored them, as she had ignored everything that did not serve her once. But each night, when the palace slept, she felt it the weight of her own making. The prayers she had spoken in candlelight returned now as echoes, and each echo carried a name. Names she wished to forget. Louis, too, felt the haunting. He no longer trusted the warmth of gold. Every glittering chandelier seemed to mock him. 1,000 false suns hung above his head. He spent more time in chapel than at feast. The courtiers whispered that he was seeking salvation, but salvation was not what he wanted. He wanted to feel clean again. He had built Versailles to outshine heaven. Now he feared heaven was watching. The queen, Maria Theresa, was dying. Her body, worn from childbirth and sorrow, faded quietly behind the walls of devotion. Louis had given her his name but never his heart. Now, watching her fade, he saw, for the first time, what faith without power looked like. She prayed for him until her last breath, and when she died, her rosary was still tangled around her fingers. The king did not weep publicly, but for weeks after, the chapel candles burned day and night. Versailles had lost its queen, and something within the king had gone dark. Montespan tried to reclaim him, but her words fell into silence. She was no longer the flame that warmed him, only the smoke that lingered when the fire was gone. Louis turned instead toward a quieter figure, the governess of his children, Madame de Montespan. She was pious, plain, unadorned. Her eyes held no ambition, only patience. She listened to him, truly listened, and where others flattered, she prayed. Her presence was like winter sunlight, cold but pure. Montespan watched it happen in silence. It was not the loss of love that broke her, but the loss of meaning. For years, she had been the center of his universe. Now she was a shadow drifting along the corridors of the palace she had helped build. She began to withdraw from court. Her jewels were locked away, hair gowns forgotten. In the chapel, she sat alone, eyes fixed on the crucifix, the scent of incense replacing that of perfume. No one dared to approach her. No one dared to remember her. The courtiers already had a new sun to orbit. Faith. As Louis aged, his reign entered a new phase, the era of atonement. He banned indecency from court. He ordered shorter gowns, stricter prayers, fewer danses. The same king who once bathed in flattery now demanded silence. Versailles changed with him. The music softened, the laughter thinned. The palace that had once been an altar to pleasure became a monastery of gold. Every hall glittered still, but the light felt colder now, like sunlight over frost. In her exile, Montespan wrote letters she never sent. To the king, to her children, to God, no reply ever came. When she finally left Versailles, no crowd gathered to watch her go. Only a handful of servants followed the carriage. As it rolled through the golden gates, the fountains were silent that morning. The air was gray. It was as if the palace itself wished not to remember. She retreated to a convent near Poitiers, where she spent the rest of her days in quiet repentance. She prayed for the king's soul and for her own. Those who saw her said she had become unrecognizable, thin, pale, almost spectral. Her eyes no longer burned. They merely reflected candlelight, but she never lost her pride. Even in penance, she demanded the best linens, the finest bread, the purest water. She remained, until the end, the woman who once ruled the Sunday. At Versailles, Louis grew older, lonelier, more devout and more haunted. He could not erase her memory. In the hush of prayer, he sometimes thought he heard her voice, the whisper that once made him feel immortal. And in the gilded mirrors of the hall, sometimes, when the candlelight flickered, he saw her reflection, not as she was, but as she might have been, if neither had believed themselves gods. The Sun King had reached his zenith. The empire glittered. The fountain sang. But beneath the marble, the worms of guilt began to move. He had conquered nations, built heaven on earth, but now he discovered the truth Mazarin once warned him of. Power is theater, never let them see the man. And for the first time, he could no longer hide the man. The year was at its height. Versailles gleamed like a mirror of the heavens, and France, vast, disciplined, splendid, moved to the rhythm of one man's will. Every sunrise began with the same ritual. Courtiers pressed against the gilded doors, waiting for the privilege of witnessing the king awaken. He was the axis around which the world revolved, When he rose, France breathed. When he slept, the nation rested. To serve him was honor. To be seen by him was grace. To displease him was erasure. The Sun King had mastered the divine illusion, and now he ruled not by fear, but by awe. The gardens of Versailles stretched endlessly, each tree trimmed to perfection, each fountain choreographed to the music of the court composer. It was a kingdom of geometry, a dream sculpted in marble and water. Every detail spoke his name. Even the birds seemed to pause when he passed, as though creation itself had been trained to obey. Visitors from every crown in Europe arrived to marvel. The ambassadors from Venice, Sweden, and Spain stood humbled before a man who had turned luxury into language. Versailles was not merely a palace. It was a declaration. I am the state. The wars of expansion had made France both feared and envied. The banners of the fleur-de-lis fluttered across Flanders and the Rhine. Generals swore that the king's gaze brought them victory, and every triumph on the battlefield was celebrated with fireworks that lit the heavens above the palace. Versailles simply continued, as if she had never existed at all. In the Hall of Mirrors, he stood as the embodiment of eternity. The chandeliers burned with thousands of flames, their light reflecting endlessly across the walls. Each mirror multiplied him, and in that endless repetition, he saw the proof of his own immortality. He did not see the fatigue in his eyes, the lines etched by years of command. He saw only the god he had become. At court, life unfolded like a stage play. Every movement was rehearsed, every glance measured. Even silence had a rank. Nobles who once ruled provinces now competed for the honor of handing him a glove or holding his candlestick at night. They lived on proximity, addicted to the light that destroyed them. Versailles was not only a palace, it was a machine for worship. And Louis was both its engineer and its prisoner. Madame de Montespan, the quiet widow who had replaced ambition with devotion, now reigned beside him in secrecy. Their union, though never crowned, was one of faith and fatigue. She had no jewels, no laughter that echoed down marble halls, only an unshakable calm that soothed his restless soul. Where Montespan had fed his hunger for glory, Maintenon fed his hunger for peace. She spoke of humility, of grace, of the duty owed to God rather than to pleasure. And slowly, Versailles began to change again. The masquerades grew fewer. The music softened to hymns. The laughter of courtiers was replaced by the murmur of prayer. Even the king's attire transformed. The crimson silks of youth gave way to the dark velvets of repentance. He still stood radiant before his people, but within him, something had shifted. The sun had reached its zenith, and in its brilliance, he saw the long shadow it cast. France prospered outwardly, yet beneath the gold, the cracks began to form. Taxes rose, the peasantry groaned, and the glory of the wars began to feel like exhaustion. The king's ministers Colbert, Louvois, each built empires of paper and iron, draining the lifeblood of a nation to sustain the theater of divine kingship. But no one dared to tell the king the truth. To question him was blasphemy. To warn him was treason. And so the illusion endured. At night, when the palace slept, Louis would walk alone through the Hall of Mirrors. The candles burned low, their reflections stretching into infinity. He could see himself repeated again and again, young, eternal, untouchable. But he could also see something else now. The emptiness between the mirrors, the space where light failed to reach. He had become both the light and the void. The priests praised him as God's chosen monarch. The poets immortalized his conquests. The artists painted him with sunbursts around his head. And yet, in his private chapel, when the incense curled around the crucifix, he felt small again. Smaller than the crown, smaller than the gold, smaller than the silence that followed each prayer. He wondered, sometimes, if the sun had ever truly been divine, or merely a flame consuming itself in beauty. From the highest balcony of Versailles, he watched his kingdom glow beneath the dawn. The fields stretched to the horizon. The cities thrived. The people sang his name. He had become everything he once desired. The world bowed before him, History itself had already begun to carve his likeness in marble. But he could not escape one truth. Everything that rose toward heaven must one day fall. And though the sun shone brighter than ever, the air around him had begun to cool. The world still called him Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, but by now the light had become blinding. Every gesture, every breath had been absorbed into the machine of ceremony. Even his loneliness was public, wrapped in incense and applause. He moved through Versailles like a ghost crowned in gold. Behind the shimmer of the chandeliers, behind the orchestras and the polished marble, a silence had begun to spread. A silence heavier than any crown. The years of glory had drained the kingdom. France, radiant at its center, was hollow at its edges. Villages burned after wars of conquest. Fields lay bare, stripped by taxes. Children starved while fountains sang at Versailles. The peasants prayed not for salvation, but for bread. But their voices could not reach the palace. Gold walls make excellent prisons for sound. Inside Versailles, the illusion persisted. Banquets glittered, orchestras swelled, and courtiers bowed lower than ever. They feared not the king's wrath, but his absence, for to be unseen was to cease existing. They laughed too loudly, complimented too quickly, and gossiped about piety as if it were perfume. But she never lost her pride. Even in penance, she demanded the best linens, the finest bread, the purest water. She remained, until the end, the woman who once ruled the Sunday. Louis began to age in the mirrors. The curls of his hair turned pale. His eyes, once sharp and certain, now glimmered with fatigue. He could no longer dance as Apollo. The god had turned mortal. The armor of perfection was cracking, and behind it was a man terrified of decay. Every ache in his body felt like a prophecy. Every funeral in the court reminded him that even divine light could flicker. Madame de Montespan watched him quietly, her face serene, her presence the only stillness in the palace of endless performance. She urged him toward faith. She replaced masks with sermons, silk with prayer books, pleasure with repentance. Versailles began to change tone. A theater turned monastery. The laughter that once spilled from the salons was now confined to whispers behind closed doors. The courtiers adjusted as they always did. They prayed in gold embroidery, repented in mirrors, and sinned only in secret. But Louis felt no peace. The more he prayed, the further heaven seemed. The more he built, the more fragile everything became. He had spent his life defying mortality, and now mortality had begun its patient siege. The fountains sometimes stopped flowing, their pipes frozen or clogged. The gardens, once a living symbol of control, began to wilt in unexpected droughts. Nature, like time, was reminding the king that no hand, however divine, can command the seasons forever. The ministers who once glorified him were dead or fallen from grace. Colbert, his architect of prosperity, gone. Louvois, his hammer of war, buried. The young men who fought in his name now filled unmarked graves along the Rhine and Pyrenees. Their blood had watered his glory, and the harvest it yielded was emptiness. France stood vast but weary, its riches flowing into one glittering, hungry heart, Versailles. And still, the king performed. He attended mass daily, presided over councils, and received ambassadors who bowed so deeply they nearly kissed the marble floor. Yet within him, a weariness had grown into something darker, a hollow throne inside his chest. He had conquered everything except himself. He could make a man vanish, but not his own doubts. He could command armies, but not silence his conscience. Every prayer felt like an echo, thrown into an empty cathedral. The queen was gone. Madame de Montespan, the great flame of his youth, had retreated to a convent. The laughter of their children had faded into the long corridors of memory. Now there was only the shuffle of servants, the ticking of clocks, and the slow decay of a man once worshipped as immortal. He no longer saw the mirrors as proof of eternity, but as witnesses to his solitude. Outside, the people whispered, "Doxis, famine, plague." They saw in Versailles not a sun, but a fire that devoured the land. Priests still blessed his reign, but peasants cursed it under their breath. The light that had once dazzled all of Europe now cast shadows across every village in France. The king's radiance had become the country's eclipse. One morning, Louis watched the sunrise from his balcony. The same golden horizon he had once sworn to command. It was beautiful, but no longer his. The light touched the fields, the roofs, the river, and he realized for the first time that it shone for everyone, not just for him. He had mistaken warmth for possession. He had built a palace to house the sun and discovered only mirrors reflecting himself. For all his power, he had never held the light. He had only chased it. In the chapel, candles flickered and rose like small, trembling souls. Louis knelt, his crown heavy, his heart heavier. He prayed not for victory, not for glory, but for forgiveness. Yet even now, he did not know whom he was asking, God or himself. That night, Versailles lay silent. No laughter, no music, no pageant, only the steady breathing of a nation exhausted by its own dream. The moonlight spilled through the hall of mirrors, washing the golden walls in silver. Louis passed through it slowly, each reflection older than the last. In that infinite corridor of his own image, the King of Light finally understood. Immortality is not to be worshipped, it is to be remembered. And remembrance, like light, only exists when there is darkness to reflect it. The dawn of 1688 broke not in gold, but in smoke. The fields of Flanders were gray with frost, and the rivers of Europe carried the reflection of war. From his gilded palace, Louis looked outward once more, toward borders that defied him, toward thrones that refused to kneel. He had ruled for decades. He had made France the envy of the world. But glory, like the sun, demands constant burning. To remain divine, he had to keep conquering. To stay eternal, he had to keep killing. He ordered new armies raised, men who had never seen Versailles, men who fought not for faith or nation, but for survival under the banner of a god-king. The drums echoed from Burgundy to Brittany. Peasants left their plows for muskets. The air filled with the stench of melted iron and fear. Louis called it destiny. France called it duty. The world called it dread. The Dutch prayed behind their dikes. The Germans sealed their cities. England, once kin through royal blood, now turned its cannons toward France. Europe had learned his rhythm, his hunger for dominance, his endless need to prove the sun could not fade. And so, kingdoms that once bowed began to unite, not out of loyalty to one another, but from exhaustion with him. They named it the Grand Alliance, a wall of nations built against one man. Versailles did not know silence anymore. Orders rang through marble halls. Maps littered the tables once used for feasts. Gold plates were replaced with iron swords. The Sun King became the War King. Every campaign another prayer, every battle another verse in the Gospel of Pride. But war, unlike worship, demands blood. And the fountains of Versailles no longer sang loud enough to drown the screams of Europe. Winter after winter, Louis's armies marched through mud, through snow, through graves of their own making. They took towns and lost them, won fields and buried sons in them. Victories came slower, losses came heavier. Even the heralds of triumph returned with eyes hollowed by fatigue. The banners that once shone with lilies of gold were now tattered with ash and rain. What had begun as divine conquest was turning into slow crucifixion. Inside Versailles, illusion persisted. Plays were still performed, fountains still danced, and servants still bowed low. But beneath the ceremony, everyone could feel it. The tightening noose of war. The nobles whispered about famine. The treasury was nearly empty. Gold, once flowing like sunlight, had become as rare as mercy. Louis's ministers concealed numbers beneath eloquence, but he knew. He saw the accounts, the debts, the cracks forming in his kingdom's armor. For every victory on the field, 100 homes went cold. The people began to curse his name quietly. Behind church doors, in fields, gone barren from overtaxation. The Sun King no longer lit their world. He drained it. His glory was their hunger. His eternity, their extinction. Yet no one dared to speak aloud what everyone knew. The king's wars were no longer for France. They were for himself. He was not fighting enemies anymore. He was fighting the setting sun. In the north, villages burned like offerings to a god who never looked down. Women buried husbands, mothers buried sons, and still the banners marched. Louis' generals began to die one by one. Turenne, Condé, Luxembourg, each taking a piece of his youth with them. He replaced them with younger men, but none carried the same fire. For the first time in his reign, the King of Light began to fear the dark. In Paris, plague crept through the narrow streets. The poor whispered that heaven was punishing the king for his arrogance. Priests spoke of repentance, philosophers of ruin. But at Versailles, repentance took the form of another campaign. Louis still believed that God favored kings who acted, not knelt. And so he acted again and again, until action itself became his only prayer. The years blurred into one another. Armies marched out and limped home. The same victories, the same treaties, each one bought at higher cost. Louis' once bright blue banners now returned dust-stained and blood-streaked. The music that greeted soldiers home sounded like mourning hymn. And through it all, the king still rose each morning to the ritual of light, the lever du roi, the moment the sun appeared before his court. The same ceremony, the same applause. But now the light revealed age, the gold, corrosion. In his private chapel, he began to pray longer. He still wore the crown, but his prayers had changed. He no longer asked for triumph, only for time, to see another sunrise, to win one more battle, to outlast one more ally turned enemy. Time, he now knew, was the true battlefield. And even a king could not conquer that. The gardens of Versailles withered in neglect. The fountains sputtered. The once manicured hedges grew wild, as if nature itself had grown tired of obedience. The mirrors no longer flattered. They revealed decay. Louis's reflection, framed in gold, looked like a relic, a monument to himself. He could feel history pressing in, the weight of years like armor turned to stone. His victories had made France vast, but his wars were making it hollow. The winter of 1709 came like punishment. It did not arrive as snow but as judgment. Across France, rivers froze solid. The wheat withered before spring. Cattle died where they stood. Eyes glazed white beneath frost. Even the Seine stopped flowing, its surface a mirror of unmoving death. At Versailles, the fountains stood still, frozen sculptures of what once was abundance. The gardens, stripped bare, lay beneath a shroud of ice like the tomb of a kingdom. And through that endless white, a single flame refused to die. The will of Louis XIV. He was 70 years old. His legs ached with infection, his sleep haunted by the dead. But still, he rose before dawn, the ritual unchanged, the courtiers gathering to witness the rising of their Sunday. He walked slowly now, each step heavy upon the marble. The crown no longer fit as easily upon his head. Its weight had changed. It no longer symbolized eternity. It measured it. Each day that began was one day closer to dusk. Letters from the countryside arrived by the hundreds. Villages starving, towns abandoned. The people begged for grain, for mercy. But the treasury was dust. The silver had been melted to fund the war. The jewels of the crown had been pawned to pay for soldiers' boots. Even the nobles whispered that France bled too deeply. Still, the king commanded armies to march. The War of the Spanish Succession dragged on, a war no longer of ambition, but of pride. Louis refused surrender. He told himself that God had once crowned him. Therefore, God would not let him fall. But the heavens were silent. The sky that once blazed gold now hung in gray exhaustion. In Flanders, corpses froze standing. In Burgundy, mothers wrapped dead children in hay to keep them from the wolves. The once great nation of France, the land of Apollo and glory, became a wasteland of famine and despair. And still, at Versailles, candles burned all night, consuming wax faster than bread could be made. The palace glowed while the countryside starved. The people began to call him not Le Roi Soleil, but Le Roi Famine. Inside the palace, silence spread like frost. Dinners became sparse. Music faltered. The laughter that once echoed through mirrored halls died into whispers of dread. Louis prayed more than he ruled now, his chapel filled with incense. Thick clouds meant to hide his doubt from God. He prayed for victory, for forgiveness, for deliverance from the shadow he himself had cast. But no prayer could change the sound that haunted him most, the quiet, the sound of a kingdom holding its breath. One morning, as the frost broke upon the gardens, he looked out from his window. Where fountains once danced, only ice and ravens moved. He remembered the ballets, the music, the days when he was Apollo incarnate. Now he could barely stand. The god who once danced upon the stage was trapped within his own creation, a theater of gold that had turned into a tomb. He thought of his queen, long dead, of Montespan, buried in scandal, of his children, most gone before him. Every conquest had cost him a heart, every victory, a life. The empire he built from devotion and discipline was now held together by ghosts. And yet, the war continued. Every letter from the front was the same. Troops dying of hunger, horses collapsing in mud, commanders begging for peace. Louis read them all, his hand trembling but his will unbroken. To stop now would mean to admit mortality, to confess that the sun could, indeed, set, so he did not stop. He signed decrees with a shaking hand. He approved new levies, new taxes, new deaths. The pen scratched like a blade across the parchment, writing not words, but epitaphs. In Paris, riots began. Bread was gone. Men tore apart bakeries. Women carried infants with no milk to give. The king's soldiers suppressed them, but even they were hungry. And still Versailles stood untouched, its chandeliers bright, its marble polished. The illusion of divine power remained intact, even as the world beyond its gates turned to ash. The courtiers bowed lower now, not from reverence, but from fear. Fear of what would happen when the sun finally went dark. Then came the message. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, loss after loss. Each one a knife to the golden heart of France. Louis read the final report in silence. A list of names, all dead. Among them, his own grandson, the ink smeared beneath his tears. For the first time in his reign, no prayer came, only the stillness of a man realizing that eternity had limits. He sat alone in his study, surrounded by maps once colored in his triumph. Now, they looked like a funeral cloth. The Sun King lowered his head, and for a moment, he was only Louis. Outside, the frost began to melt. Spring returned to France, timid and pale. But the joy that came with the thaw did not reach Versailles. The fountains flowed again, yet their music felt hollow, like a requiem played too late. The court resumed its rituals, the nobles their smiles. But something irreparable had shifted. The spell of divine monarchy was broken. Louis had won many wars, but he had lost the illusion that sustained them. He began to withdraw from the world he had built. The court still worshipped him, but he saw through them now, through the gold, the masks, the flattery. He had spent a lifetime turning power into theater. Now the stage was empty. Each night, he watched the sun set through the same gilded window. The light turned the marble blood red before it disappeared. He watched until only darkness remained, until the reflection in the glass was his own. A man made of light, consumed by it. The palace no longer glittered. It glowed faintly, like a candle nearing its end. After decades of fire, the light of Versailles had softened, not extinguished, but dimmed to a sacred hush. The wars had drained the coffers. The courtiers' laughter had thinned into murmurs, and the mirrors that once multiplied the sun now reflected a face worn thin by years and grief. Louis XIV walked slowly through the hall of mirrors, its marble floors echoing with the weight of memory. He had built this place to be eternal, to immortalize the radiance of his youth And yet now every reflection mocked him. The man who once shone like a god had become a pilgrim moving through his own monument. He no longer wore the extravagant silks of his prime. The lace was simpler, the jewels fewer. The grandeur remained, but it had turned somber, like the vestments of a priest. At dawn, he no longer led ballets. He led prayers. The Sun King had turned his gaze from Apollo to Christ, from conquest to contrition. For years, he had believed glory would grant him immortality. Now he sought something quieter, absolution. And she, Madame de Montespan, was the keeper of that silence. She entered his life not like a flame, but like a shadow. No grand entrance, no scandal, only a presence steady, devout, unyielding. She had once been a governess to his illegitimate children, a woman of humility and intelligence. Her piety wrapped not in spectacle but in purpose. Where others had adored the king, she questioned the man. Where others praised his divinity, she reminded him of his soul. In her, Louis found something he had never sought before. Not passion, not power, but peace. Their meetings were quiet. No court musicians, no perfume of intrigue. Only the murmur of prayer and the faint rustle of pages. Scripture, not poetry. Outside, the frost began to melt. Spring returned to France, timid and pale. But the joy that came with the thaw did not reach Versailles. The chapel of Versailles rose slowly. A cathedral within a palace, its marble carved not to glorify a king, but to humble him. When it was finished, Louis stood before its altar for hours, the flicker of candles painting his face in trembling gold. It was the first light in years that did not burn. The courtiers whispered. They feared her influence. This woman, who asked for no title, who preferred prayer to pleasure, who spoke not of empire but of eternity. They called her the Silent Queen. Some despised her, others pitied her, but Louis trusted her completely. In her stillness, he found the echo of a conscience long buried under ceremony. She did not heal him, but she allowed him to see the wounds. Beyond the palace, France remained broken. The war was over, but the peace was hollow. Villages rebuilt in silence, the dead uncounted, the land scarred by years of hunger. Louis knew it. He felt it in the letters, in the confessions of bishops, in the hollow cheer of nobles pretending that glory had returned. Every decision he made now was marked by restraint. He no longer sought to expand, only to endure. For the first time in his reign, he saw the limits of power, and they frightened him more than defeat ever had. Madame de Montespan became his compass in this dimming world. Together, they attended Mass daily. They ate in silence, read in silence, mourned in silence. The king, who once commanded the heavens, now bowed his head before them. He confessed sins not to the people, but to God. He spoke no longer of destiny, only of duty. She never called him Majesty when they were alone. She called him nothing at all, and in that wordless space, he rediscovered himself. At night, when the palace slept, he walked through the chapel corridors alone. He traced the carvings of angels with his hand, feeling their cold faces beneath his fingertips. The marble did not warm, but he no longer expected it to. The echoes of his own footsteps followed him, a reminder of every step taken in pride, every life consumed by ambition. He prayed not for victory, not for power, but for forgiveness for those he had failed to protect. Outside, the moonlight bathed the empty gardens. The fountains murmured again, their music, gentler now, like the sighs of a weary soul. He ordered the education of the poor, the reform of hospitals, the restoration of churches destroyed by war. Each act, a fragment of penance. Each decree, a prayer written in ink. But the courtiers grumbled. They missed the feasts, the masquerades, the divine theater. Versailles was no longer the stage of gods. It had become the cloister of a penitent king. Some left for Paris, seeking laughter elsewhere. Others stayed, bound not by loyalty, but by inertia. The palace remained radiant, but it was the radiance of a candle before dawn. Louis grew weaker. His gait slowed. His hands trembled when he lifted the scepter. The Sun King no longer blazed. He flickered. And yet, even in decline, his dignity held. He still attended every ceremony, still addressed every matter of state, still prayed as though the heavens watched. But the eyes that followed him no longer saw a god. They saw a man, a frail, devout, aging monarch clinging not to power, but to purpose. In the evenings, when he and Maintenon sat together, they did not speak of empire or eternity, only of peace, the kind he had never known in life, and now desperately sought before death. Sometimes she would read aloud from the Psalms, her voice low, measured, like the sound of water over stone. He listened without a word, his gaze fixed upon the flicker of a candle. Each verse seemed to mirror his reign. Glory and ruin intertwined, light and judgment inseparable. When she finished reading, he would close his eyes. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, like the pause between two prayers. And in that stillness, the king who once called himself the sun understood something he never had before, that all light ends not in darkness, but in surrender. The mornings had grown quieter at Versailles. The courtiers no longer crowded outside his chamber door. The ceremonies were shortened, the trumpets muted. The man who once dictated the rhythm of the universe now woke to the rhythm of his own failing heart. The Sun King was dying slowly, devoutly, and awake. His legs, once trained for the grand ballets of his youth, had become frail and swollen, the veins dark as bruised marble. He could no longer stand for the mass he had ordered built. And so, seated in a gilded chair beneath the vault of his chapel, he prayed while others knelt. It was not pride that kept him upright. It was habit. He had been a statue of power too long to crumble before witnesses. The light through the stained glass fell across his face, like the shadow of a crown. No longer the gold of noon, but the dim amber of sunset. Madame de Montespan stood beside him each morning, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on eternity. She did not touch him. She did not need to. Her silence had become the air he breathed. The courtiers still whispered about her. Some said she had married him in secret. Others claimed she ruled through faith what she never ruled through title. But she never spoke in her own defense. She served not the crown, but the soul that wore it. The woman who once governed children now governed the conscience of a king. Louis had begun to measure time differently, not by victories or ceremonies, but by prayers. Each sunrise was no longer an act of dominion, but a reprieve. He ordered fewer banquets, fewer festivals. The fountains were allowed to rest. The marble halls echoed with footsteps, not music. The light through the stained glass fell across his face, like the shadow of a crown. No longer the gold of noon, but the dim amber of sunset. The light through the stained glass fell across his face, like the shadow of a crown. No longer the gold of noon, but the dim amber of sunset. In his private chamber, Louis kept only one candle burning. It illuminated the crucifix above his bed, the symbol of a power greater than his own. He stared at it each night, as though trying to recognize himself within that suffering. The man who had once been worshipped, now worshipped in return. He confessed to his confessor not his triumphs, but his regrets. The wars that had consumed millions, the sons he had buried, the vanity that had replaced faith for so many years. Every confession lifted something unseen, as though each sin were a stone removed from the tomb of his heart. Madame de Montespan began spending long hours in prayer for him. She asked for his soul's peace, not his body's healing. He did not deserve eternity, she believed, but perhaps, through repentance, he could earn mercy. And mercy came not as light, but as acceptance. The king's pain grew worse, but he no longer feared it. He saw it as penance, the final tax upon his mortal reign. Outside, the seasons turned with quiet indifference. Autumn crept through the gardens, turning every golden leaf into a fragment of his story. The fountains whispered his requiem, their waters carrying the memory of 1,000 celebrations, now gone to mist. The courtiers avoided his chamber. They preferred to remember him as he had been, the radiant monarch, the living Apollo, the god of France. But in truth, Louis XIV had become something greater than a god. He had become human. In the stillness of his final weeks, he spoke little. He listened to the bells of the chapel, to the rustle of robes in prayer, to the faint laughter of children playing beyond the garden. The courtiers, deprived of spectacle, wandered aimlessly through corridors of silence. The mirrors still reflected gold, but no longer warmth. He understood now that eternity could not be built in stone or gold. It could only be found in surrender. Versailles had been his monument, Maintenon, his conscience, faith, his redemption. The day before his death, the sky above Versailles was pale and still. The air carried the scent of rain, as though heaven itself was preparing to wash the palace clean. Louis asked to be taken to the chapel one final time. The courtiers hesitated, but Maintenon insisted. And so, in silence, they carried him through the corridors he had built, past the marble gods that had once mirrored his own image. Each step was a farewell. He looked upon the golden altar, the candles flickering like stars across a sea of marble. The air shimmered with the light of devotion, and he felt, perhaps for the first time, small beneath it. He closed his eyes, not in despair, but in gratitude. The Sun King, who had once commanded light, now let it pass through him. That night, Maintenon prayed beside his bed. No words were spoken, only the steady rhythm of his breath. And then the long pause when it stopped. The candle beside him burned low, its wax melting into a perfect pool, the last reflection of a life built on radiance. When dawn came, Versailles did not awaken to music. The courtiers gathered in silence, their faces pale as marble. The king, who had ruled for 72 years, lay still beneath a veil of linen. The morning sun filtered through the window, touching his lifeless hands with light one final time. It was not the brilliance of noon that filled the chamber, but the serenity of dawn, the hour when night and day meet in perfect balance. Madame de Montespan did not weep. She bowed her head and whispered a prayer too soft for any to hear. Then she left the chamber, walking through the palace he had filled with her silence. Behind her, the candle beside his bed finally died. But the air still glowed faintly, as though the sun itself had lingered a moment longer to say goodbye. Versailles mourned. The bells tolled across France, echoing through cathedrals, through fields, through ruins. The Sun King had fallen, and yet his light remained, not in the gold, not in the marble, not in the mirrors, but in the quiet lessons of his end, that all power bends to time, and all pride must one day kneel. The twilight of Louis XIV began not with thunder, but with silence. It crept through Versailles like a shadow under the door, slow, inevitable, and unseen until it filled every corner. The court had grown older with him. The faces that once danced and schemed now hid behind powder and fans, trying to preserve the illusion that time had not conquered even them. But the Sun King no longer looked toward mirrors. He had outlived vanity. Each morning, he rose later. The rituals that once marked the dawn of France now felt like burdens. The courtiers still gathered for the lever, the royal rising, but the grandeur had faded. The curtains opened, and instead of blinding radiance, the light revealed the tremor of a hand, the pallor of flesh once worshipped as divine. Louis had become a relic of his own legend. The golden robes weighed too much. The crown pressed too hard against his temples. His footsteps echoed hollowly through the marble halls. A ghost, walking through his own creation. Versailles, the monument he had built to defy time, was turning into his tomb. Outside, France groaned. The wars had drained the land. Villages starved under the burden of his glory. The peasants no longer sang his name in the fields. They cursed it, quietly, as they buried their dead. But no such cries reached the gilded walls of the palace. Within, the air smelled of incense and decay. Perfume could not mask the sickness of the old monarch. Louis's leg had begun to rot from gangrene. The punishment of years standing in armor, years of dancing and marching in golden shoes meant for gods, not men. The pain was constant now, and yet He endured it with the stoic majesty that had defined his reign. Even in agony, he would not be seen as weak. For the sun must never set in front of its worshippers. The physicians hovered around him like crows in lace collars. They whispered theories, bled him, prayed over him, each trying to cure what could not be cured: mortality. At night, the king slept little. He sat by the window, wrapped in furs, watching the moonlight spill over the fountains. The statues outside, once gleaming in daylight, now appeared as solemn sentinels, guarding a monarch trapped in his own eternity. Sometimes he could hear the distant toll of church bells, not for war, nor victory, but for death. They tolled often. Madame de Montespan stayed near, silent as ever. Her presence had become his last ceremony, a ritual of compassion, measured and calm. She read scriptures beside him, her voice low, her faith unwavering, but even her serenity could not ease the weight of his regrets. He saw them everywhere, in the faces of dead sons, in the portraits of mistresses faded with dust, in the eyes of courtiers who waited not for his recovery, but for his end. They bowed lower than ever, but their silence was not devotion. It was anticipation. The palace had become a waiting room for death. Servants walked softly, candles burned longer, and whispers carried further than prayers. Every sound seemed to echo: the scrape of a chair, the closing of a door, the faint crackle of fire in the hearth. Even the gardens, once orchestrated to perfection, had begun to decay. Leaves fell untended. The fountains sputtered, their waters choked with fallen petals in time. It was as though nature herself had decided to reclaim what had been stolen from her. The illusion of control. Louis spent his last months dictating memories. He ordered the construction of his own tomb, the last piece of his eternal architecture. He gave final instructions for his burial: na gold, na marble procession, only modest dignity. A strange humility for a man who once wore the Sunday. He spoke often of legacy, but more often of God. The man who once declared, "L'État, c'est moi," now whispered only to heaven. The courtiers called his piety noble. In truth, it was terror, the reckoning of a soul that had ruled as if eternity were his by right. One evening, as the sun set behind Versailles, the entire sky turned crimson, a blaze of light that set the clouds aflame. The courtiers gasped, believing it a divine sign, a farewell salute to the King of Light. But Louis, watching from his bed, saw something different. To him, the sky was not celebrating. It was burning, a mirror of his own empire, brilliant, beautiful, and doomed. He felt the warmth on his withered hands and understood what no courtier dared say aloud. His sun was setting, and France would soon face a night it was not prepared for. In his final letters, Louis wrote to his great-grandson, the Dauphin, to come. He told the boy to love peace, to rule gently, to remember that kings are not gods, only custodians of God's time. It was a confession disguised as advice, an apology written in the language of duty. He signed it with a trembling hand, the ink blotting like a wound on the page. As the year waned, so did he. His appetite vanished. The mirrors were covered. The musicians no longer played. Versailles had gone mute. Even the courtiers began to speak softly, as though afraid to disturb the spirit already halfway gone. At night, only one sound remained constant: the slow ticking of the great clock in the Hall of Mirrors. Each tick was a heartbeat. Each heartbeat, a reminder that even the Sun King could not command time. The priests began the vigil. They read prayers in Latin as he slept fitfully, his body shrouded in linen, his breath shallow and uneven. The smell of incense filled the chamber, mingling with the scent of medicine and fading life. Maintenon sat beside him, her eyes on the candle burning at the foot of the bed. She had lit it herself and promised to let it die only when he did. Outside, dawn approached. The horizon glowed faintly, not gold, but gray. A soft rain began to fall, dimming the light on the windows of Versailles. The world was preparing for its longest night. And within, the man who had ruled for 72 years turned his face away from the light. as though he had finally accepted that even the sun must rest. The candle beside the royal bed had burned through the night. Its flame bent and flickered, struggling against the weight of dawn. Outside the windows, the gardens of Versailles lay drowned in mist, the statues glistening like mourners carved in frost. Louis XIV had not moved for hours. His breath came in shallow sighs, each one weaker than the last. The air was thick with incense and the faint murmur of prayer. Yet even the priests sounded tired, as though the kingdom itself had run out of words to offer God. The courtiers waited, in adjoining chambers, their silks whispering, their fans fluttering nervously. They had seen kings die before, but none who had been the nation's very heartbeat. Now every second felt like treason, every blink a betrayal of the gaze fixed upon the dying Sunday. The Duke of Orleans, pale and trembling, stood near the door, clutching a crucifix. The bishops murmured blessings. The physicians stared into their hands, as though searching for a cure that no science could invent. And in the center of it all, Louis, the Eternal, lay small beneath the weight of his own legend. His leg was blackened, the flesh rotting away. The pain had long surpassed human measure, yet his face remained composed, the features still touched with a terrible dignity. Even in decay, he looked like a painting, as though the Sun King refused to die as a man. In the silence, the candle's wax began to drip down the brass holder, pooling like molten gold upon the marble floor. Every drop fell in rhythm with his faltering heart. It was as if Versailles itself was melting, the palace crying the tears he no longer could. Madame de Montespan sat at his side, her hands clasped. She had not slept in days. Her lips moved in prayer, but her eyes were fixed on the flame that trembled at his bedside. She remembered the man who once danced as Apollo, who laughed beneath chandeliers, who believed beauty could conquer death. Now he was pale and distant, his voice gone, his soul already somewhere between the bed and the ceiling, where the frescoes of angels watched silently, painted witnesses to the fall of a god. In the gardens, the first rays of sunlight struggled through the fog. They reached the windows of the king's chamber, but the light that entered was weak, diluted, as though heaven itself hesitated to intrude upon such solemnity. Louis's eyes fluttered open once, two pale embers in the shadow. He looked toward the faint gleam across the floor, the light he had once commanded, the light that had obeyed him for 72 years. Now it arrived uninvited, ungoverned, pure, and for the first time he did not rise to meet it. The priests gathered closer, their Latin chants rising like smoke. A crucifix was lifted before him. Holy water touched his forehead. The room swelled with murmured amen. But the king's gaze had already turned inward. He saw the ghosts of his empire. Catherine, Maria Theresa, Montespan, Maintenon, faces blurred by incense and time. He saw his dead sons, his fallen soldiers, his starving peasants praying in the snow. He saw the golden fountains spraying over graves. He saw Versailles shining in eternity, a monument not of glory, but of guilt. And in that instant, Louis XIV understood the terrible symmetry of power. To make oneself immortal is to erase everyone else. The candle flickered again. Its flame thinned, wavering like breath on glass. The courtiers bowed their heads. The silence deepened until it became a sound of its own, the sound of history exhaling. Then softly the candle went out. No thunder, no cry, only a whisper of smoke that curled upward, a final gesture of defiance against oblivion. The king was dead. Outside, the bells of Versailles began to toll. They rang not in triumph, but exhaustion. The longest reign in European history had ended, and with it, an era of divine illusion. The courtiers fell to their knees. Some wept, others calculated. In that chamber, even grief was political. The body was washed, wrapped in linen, and placed within a coffin of black wood lined with silver. On his chest, they laid a crucifix. Beneath his hands, a single lily, symbol of France, symbol of purity, a symbol the living no longer believed in. The procession began at dusk. The coffin was carried through the Hall of Mirrors, that vast corridor of reflected suns. Hundreds of candles burned on either side, their light caught in 1,000 panes of glass. As the coffin passed, each reflection seemed to follow 1,000 Louis XIVs, fading one by one into darkness. The courtiers walked in silence, their shadows stretching long across the marble floor. Outside, rain began to fall again, washing the gold from the statues, turning the gravel paths into rivers of mud. When they reached the chapel, the monks began to chant the De Profundis. Their voices rose like waves against the vaulted ceiling. Out of the depths I cry to thee, O Lord. Each syllable echoed through the palace that once echoed with music, now reduced to a single note of mourning. The coffin was lowered into the crypt, and the stone slab slid shut. The echo lingered, a soft, hollow sound, like the closing of a book too heavy to reopen. The courtiers filed out, leaving behind only the faint scent of wax and death. Madame de Montespan lingerläst. She looked once at the sealed tomb, then up at the gilded ceiling where cherubs smiled down eternally. They were beautiful, untouched, eternal, the way Louis had always wanted to be. She blew out the final candle. Its smoke rose in a thin, trembling line. A second soul, leaving Versailles. Outside, the dawn returned. The fountains began to flow again, the sun rose over the gilded roofs, and the mirrors filled once more with light. But something had changed. The light no longer obeyed. It no longer worshipped the palace or the man who built it. It simply shone, indifferent, free, falling equally upon stone, servant, and king. The reign of the sun was over. The sun rose the next morning as it always did. But over Versailles, it seemed hesitant, a pale imitation of the light that once answered to a single man's command. The fountain still danced, the garden still bloomed, and the palace gleamed as though nothing had changed. Yet beneath the marble and mirrors, a stillness had crept in, a silence so deep that even the servants whispered in fear. The Sun King was gone, and in his absence, the world felt suddenly mortal. The coffin was lowered into the crypt, and the stone slab slid shut. The echo lingered, a soft, hollow sound, like the closing of a book too heavy to reopen. The great ritual of dawn, the rising of the king, the dressing, the audience, was over, and with it, the heartbeat of France. The palace, once a machine of power, now lay motionless, its gears turning only out of habit. Outside, the people of Paris gathered. They lined the streets from Versailles to Saint-Denis, their faces gray with fatigue and hunger. For them, the king had been both tyrant and father, distant yet inescapable, a sun that gave light and burned at once. Now they came to see him buried, not to mourn but to witness the impossible. For if even Louis XIV could die, then perhaps God himself could. The funeral procession began at dawn. Black horses drew the gilded hearse, its wheels grinding over the cobblestones like thunder. Plumes of white and gold swayed in the wind. Priests in violet robes marched ahead, their chants echoing through the mist. Requiem aeternam donae, Domine. Grant him eternal rest, O Lord. The crowd fell to their knees as the coffin passed, some out of faith, others out of fear. Children watched in silence. Old men crossed themselves. Women wept without knowing why. For all their lives, they had lived beneath his shadow, and now that shadow was passing through them one last time. In the royal carriage behind the hearse, the young King Louis XV, a boy of 5, sat stiff and silent, his eyes wide beneath a crown too heavy for his head. He did not understand why the world looked so gray, or why the people stared at him as though he carried a curse. He only knew that every man bowed when he passed, just as they had bowed to the one now buried before him. The sun had died, but the orbit remained. At Saint-Denis, the gates opened wide. The royal necropolis waited, its stones wet with centuries of royal tears. The coffin was lowered into the vault, beside ancestors whose names had long turned to myth: Bourbon, Valois, Capetian, a lineage of dust and gold. The priests sang their final benediction, their voices trembling beneath the echoing arches. As they sealed the tomb, a single drop of water fell from the ceiling and struck the lid like a tear from heaven. The echo lingered, one last note in the great symphony of his reign. Outside, the bells of Paris tolled once more. The sound rolled across the fields and forests, through villages that had starved for his wars, over rivers that had carried his soldiers home in coffins. Each toll was a reckoning, each chime a question. What had all the glory been for? Back in Versailles, the palace awaited its new master. But the courtiers who had once thrived on spectacle now found themselves lost in the silence of their own performance. Without the sun, their orbits collapsed. Their rituals became meaningless gestures, the rise without the dawn, the bow without the throw. The grand salon stood empty. The fountains murmured to no one. In the king's chamber, the air still carried the faint scent of incense and decay. No one dared open the windows. It felt as though the light itself might escape. That night, the mirrors began to darken. Not from dust, but from something older, deeper. The gold leaf dulled. The crystal chandeliers lost their shimmer. And yet, when the servants walked by at dawn, they swore they still saw him. A glint of movement behind the glass, a flicker of gold at the edge of vision. The Sun King was gone, but his reflection remained. It wandered the palace like a restless ghost, a presence that refused to be buried. The courtiers avoided the Hall of Mirrors after dusk. They said that if you looked too long into its depths, you could still see him standing there, smiling faintly, bathed in eternal sunrise. Versailles had become a mausoleum, a temple not of power, but of memory. The music that once filled its corridors was replaced by the soft sighs of forgotten servants, the creak of distant floors, the whisper of the wind through the gilded gates. And yet, the beauty remained, untouched, eternal, merciless, like a god's laughter carved into stone. In time, the courtiers would return to their games. The fountains would run again, and new kings would learn to imitate his gestures. But none would ever glow as he did. For the Sun King had not merely ruled France. He had created the illusion that power itself could defeat death. And though he was gone, that illusion lived on. In the marble, in the mirrors, in every candle that burned too brightly to last. Centuries passed. The marble did not move. The mirrors, though dimmed by age, still shimmered faintly, as if holding on to a light that refused to die. Versailles endured. It watched kings rise and fall, revolutions bleed across France, crowds scream for liberty beneath its very gates. Yet behind its gilded doors, silence remained sovereign. The palace had become what Louis always wanted it to be. Eternal. Morning. A shaft of sunlight crawls across the Hall of Mirrors, not golden, not divine, but soft and gray, the color of time itself. Dust drifts through it like ash. The chandeliers hang motionless. A forgotten violin lies broken in a corner, its strings rusted to silence. No one dances here anymore. No one prays. Only the echoes remain. The faint rhythm of courtly footsteps, the laughter of ghosts waltzing in the dark. If you listen long enough, you can still hear the faint sound of applause. The mirrors reflect nothing human. Only light, endlessly multiplying itself, an illusion of infinity, a cathedral made of reflections. They say that if you walk through the hall alone, and the sunlight catches your eye just right, you might see him, a tall figure in gold, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes turned toward the horizon. Not a ghost, but a memory refusing to fade. For some lights do not die. They simply linger, like embers that refuse to admit the night. The gardens outside are wild now. The fountains still murmur, but the water is no longer clear. Statues lean beneath ivy, their faces cracked, their marble veins filled with rain. Yet every leaf, every path, still curves toward the palace, as if nature itself still bends around his will. The geometry of his desire endures, long after the man who dreamed it turned to dust. In a distant wing, the royal chapel sleeps. The pews are empty. The altar gleams faintly under a layer of dust. Here, Louis once knelt every morning, a god praying to another god. Now, the only prayer that remains is silence. A single candle flickers beside the altar. No hand lights it. No wind snuffs it out. It simply burns, as though time itself still obeys his rhythm. Night falls. Versailles exhale. The air hums with centuries of remembered power. The mirrors begin to glow again, not with sunlight, but with something deeper, darker, as if the gold itself remembers his gaze. Across the marble floors, faint footprints appear, barely visible, traced in the dust. They lead from the throne room to the hall of mirrors, then vanish at the farthest wall, where the king's reflection once stood. There, in the last pane of glass, something moves. A shimmer, a pulse of light, then a face. For a moment, it looks alive. The same serene mask, the same perfect stillness. But the eyes are hollow now, filled not with command, but with longing. The reflection watches itself, forever trapped between being and memory. The palace dreams. It dreams of music, of laughter, of the endless dawns, when the world revolved around one man's heartbeat. It dreams of the ballets, the prayers, the whispered sins, and in those dreams, Louis still rises. He still walks among his courtiers, each bowing like stars around the Sunday. He still lifts his hand and light obeys. But when he turns toward the mirrors, he finds no reflection waiting, just the faint echo of a crown and the soft whisper of eternity closing in. Outside, the world has forgotten. Empires have crumbled, cities have burned, revolutions have renamed the gods. But inside Versailles, nothing changes. Here, the air itself is history, perfumed with the ghost of incense and ambition. Here, Louis XIV is not dead. He is preserved, not in flesh, but in architecture. His soul, stretched thin through corridors of marble and glass. His will, etched into symmetry. His faith, fossilized in light. A tourist passes through centuries later. She pauses before the great mirror wall. Her camera flickers. In the flash for just an instant, the room glows gold again. And in that instant, the palace remembers everything. The king, the music, the endless dawn. Then, as the light fades, only the dust remains. He built a heaven that became his prison. He sought immortality and found reflection. Even now, Versailles whispers his name, not in praise, but in warning. Gold remembers what flesh forgets. The Sun King still burns, not in heaven, not in history, but in every man who believes he can outshine time itself. If the light still blinds you, if the mirrors still haunt you, like, share, subscribe, and let history burn once more.